Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We will begin with our prayer to be followed by the national anthem. May we request everyone to put yourselves in the presence of our Almighty God. Let us put ourselves in the presence of God. God Almighty, thank you for bringing us together to celebrate Cebuano culture and heritage through the sharing of our stories. We need this in this time of uncertainty, O God, to remind us of our identity as a people, unique and blessed and proud. This reminder must inspire us that whatever challenges we face, whether unseen, alien, and treacherous, can always be overcome if we are united in working for the present and the future, and for the heritage of our children and community. We pray for our present-day heroes who are fighting against the virus, as well as other threats that besiege us today. For our own people struggling to overcome these threats, and for those who have died, fallen, but never forgotten. Dearest God, heal our land. Amen.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas. Kayang magiliw.
Maayong hapon mga Sugbuanon. Welcome to Gabii sa Kabilin 2021 online activities. This is an engaging space to appreciate and experience Cebu's culture and heritage.
Wa lagi ko ning gawas. Mayang hapon sa tanan. Heidi Palapar here, JSK Event Director and your moderator for this afternoon's program. Welcome to the September webinar of Gabii sa Kabilin online activities. Daghang salamat to everyone who has joined us this afternoon from Cebu and other parts of Region 7 and the country, even those outside of the country, and especially to our teachers from DepEd and the private schools. The Gabii sa Kabilin, the Summer Heritage event of Cebu, continues its aim to preserve and promote local culture and heritage through the museums. Despite this pandemic, the Cebuano heritage community has continued to convene and collaborate to deliver online or virtual activities with the belief that in this time of confusion and disconnection, our sense of identity and pride of place can be beacons of hope and strength. Also, we continue to commemorate the 500 years since the arrival of Magellan and the Spanish influences, the introduction of Christianity, and the victory at Mactan by aligning our GSK online activities with the said occasion. This afternoon, our webinar focuses on clothing, especially during the 19th-century Spanish colonial period, the trends and the factors that influence them, the functions of clothing, the meanings, and others. Our speaker, and we're very happy that she accepted our invitation despite her very busy schedule. Our speaker has extracted all these from travel guides and writings, paintings, photographs, and periodicals she has unearthed from archives here and abroad. Before I introduce our speaker, though, may I just remind everyone that after the lecture, we have our Q&A, of course, with the trivia, where you can win prizes. Also, for those who are here joining us and want to get a certificate of participation, please note that we will post the link and open the evaluation after the webinar and only up to midnight later at exactly 11:59 p.m. to be sure. Now, let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Stephanie Mariko is the award-winning author of Clothing the Colony, 19th-century Philippine Sartorial Culture, 1820 to 1896, published by the Ateneo de Manila University Press in 2019, which recently, and congratulations to our author, received the IIAS ICAS International Book Prize 2021 as the Best Book in Humanities and English Language Edition. She is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow and at the Universidad de Granada, Spain, and Nova School of Law, Universidad Nova de Lisboa in Portugal. She obtained her PhD in history, and that's Tres Honorable Avec Felicitaciones, and from University Nice, Sofia Antipolis, France. I hope I pronounced them correctly. Master of Arts in History and Bachelor of Science in Management from the Ateneo de Manila University, Philippines. She holds an assistant professorship at the Department of History of the Ateneo de Manila University, where she served as chair of the Internalization Committee and coordinator of internationalization between 2018 and 2019. Born and raised in Bacolod City, Negros Occidental, and educated in Manila, Beijing, and Nice, Dr. Koo is a Chinese Filipino Ilongga currently living in Lisbon. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you our very esteemed resource speaker this afternoon, Dr. Stephanie Mariko. I think
Okay.
ma'am is with, yes. Hi,
Hi.
ma'am. Good afternoon.
Hi. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share the results of my research. Maayong hapon Cebu, maayong hapon Visayas, Luzon, and of course Mindanao. Hi. So I'm doing this webinar from Lisbon. So it's very early here today, and but it's a sunny day. So shall I begin already with the PowerPoint? Okay. All right. So my talk for today is about ubiquity, uniqueness, and theatricality of 19th century Philippine clothing. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. It's really about 19th century Philippine clothing in the Spanish colonial context. So I will be setting the limitations, the scope and limits of my study. The term Filipino, if you notice, is used sparingly in the 19th century. Allow me to share with you that originally my study, I wanted to focus it on textiles. So the original title was not Clothing the Colony, but Weaving the Nation. But in the 19th century, there was no nation yet. We were still a colony. So that's why I use the term Filipino, because it's still the beginnings of the identity of Filipinos as Filipinos. Meaning, earlier, Filipinos refer to Spaniards who were living or who were born in the Philippines, otherwise known as insulares. So hence, I put Filipino under quotation marks. Next slide, please. So my today's lecture will be divided into 4 parts. First will be introduction. Second will be the historical context. Third will be the evolution. I think many of you are curious about the evolution of clothing. And one of the key questions there actually is, can we really date the pieces? Can we date clothing? Can we put an exact timeline? Lastly will be, I will give you a brief overview of the kind of sources that I used. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are varied ways by which we can study clothing. The exciting thing about this topic is that not only is it beautiful, it's beautiful. It's not. It's also wonderful to talk about it because it permeates different levels of society. everybody is clothed. And if I look at images, I really had a lot of sources to work with, from newspapers to pictures, also paintings, even sketches. So, clothing, even if people were not clothed, for example, they were topless, it's still worthy of analysis. Why are they not clothed? So, the thing with clothing is we can study it for its technical aspects. We can also study it for its social cultural relevance. How was it used socially? For example, in the status game. Economically, we can look at it in terms of production, consumption, and also distribution. What was advertising like in that period? Politically, how was it used, for example, by foreign diplomats to win the affection of the local population? On the right side, you can see there are markers. Clothing are markers of race, class, gender. And what is interesting is an emerging field, which is a memory studies. How were clothes remembered? How were clothes discussed? You know what they say, we remember people, the wearers of memorable clothing. So that's an emerging field that it's very interesting to look into. So there's really room to study clothing. Okay? It's a wide scope, and what's interesting. We're dealing with the clothing of a broad and complex colonial society. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right. So I'll give you the brief overview. Uh, then the scope and limits. The 19th. I will focus on the 19th century lowland Christianized. As you can imagine, there will be less diversity because the indigenous tribes I was unable to include in my studies. One, they have their own clothing culture, they have their own color palettes, and it deserves more attention. So, when we talk about lowland Christianized, we made use of specific color palettes and also materials, which I will discuss in the next slide. So, please bear with me. The focus is really on 19th century lowland Christianized. Um, Indigenous tribes, I will just mention sparingly. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. This is a map from the book that was published by Deputy Speaker Lauren Ligarda. Um, this one shows the map of the Philippines where products or textiles were cultivated. So, for example, in the Visayas, you have piña, you have also bark, you have cotton. So this map indicates where the areas are that cultivated key textiles, no, key fibers. So we will be discussing what's unique about Philippine clothing is the materials. For example, piña. Piña, it's from the Spanish red variety. You have the 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 crown of the pineapple. This is not the edible pineapple. You cannot just get any pineapple and weave it into a fabric. The leaves of this grow between 5 to 7 feet, and that's what you use to turn into a fiber. Until today, it has escaped mechanization. I will share with you how it is categorized or classified in, for example, European archives. Next slide, please. Nipis is a blanket term which means thin. So why do they categorize it as nipis? Precisely because the different materials, there's a translucency to it. In fact, many of the materials we have to wear something underneath, of course, preferably cotton, because the material itself is quite itchy. And because of the itchy materials, you need not only to protect your skin, okay, and you also need to protect yourself from external gaze. Okay, that's why what's interesting about this, because it's translucent. Um, Women, for example, put what you would call a breast panel, which is a rectangular shape cloth in the breast area. So nipis is a blanket term, but it encompasses the variety of textiles that were translucent, or some would call it a transparent. Okay, so next slide, please. So nipis, let me share with you before you get into clothing that it has a wide use, meaning it was also made into placemats, into handkerchiefs, into pañuelo, into veils. So uh, it has wide uses, and oftentimes they would embroider it. I want to share this with you. I found this in Negros. What's interesting is this was embroidered using human hair, and it often depicts idyllic scenes, romantic scenes, even. If you look at that, it's like a harana or a serenade. Um, I always encourage that if people come to the Philippines to experience the Philippines fully, you have to go to the islands. Go beyond Manila. Of course, there's a contrast between urban and countryside lifestyles. Okay, so next slide, please. This one is another example. Again, you have the carabao there, which is an iconic Philippine animal, no? You have also, this is made of human hair. It's a one way to immortalize. One, whose hair was it? So that's one of the questions. It's usually when you, for example, give presents, you give, for example, handkerchief. You write the name of the person there who will be using the handkerchief. Oftentimes, in the case of human hair, it's the embroiderer's hair that is being displayed here. Next slide, please. All right, this one is not embroidered, but it's like hand painted. I found this in Madrid, and what's interesting about this is rarely can you find textiles that have dates. And this one is one of the few that is actually dated. If you notice clothes nowadays, like the RTW or ready to wear, there's tags, okay, who manufactured it. At the time, there's no signature as to who produced or who gave the garments. So it's what is important is how we extract the narratives from all these materials, from the variety of sources. So I will share with you later on the process of how I came up with this research. Next slide, please. Okay, so Islas Visayas, I want to show you that these are the provinces or districts that encompasses the what you would call Islas Visayas. So we have Antique, Bohol, Capiz, Cebu, Concepcion, Iloilo, Isla de Negros, Leyte, Romblon, and Samar. I will pay particular attention to Cebu today. So of course, I look through different catalogs, for example, for exhibitions, in order to see what products were being exhibited abroad. What products from any of the Visayan provinces were exported or displayed abroad. Next slide, please. Okay, one of the things that Cebu was known for was Cebu actually had a lot of products from rice, cacao, abaca, algodon or cotton, coffee, sibukao, and tobacco. Also, I will share with you in the next few slides the inhabitants. How many, based on the census, what was the population of Cebu at the time, in order to get an idea of how many people were wearing, certain types of garments, just to get a more or less a ballpark figure. Next slide, please. The historical context. Next slide, please. Okay, there were several things that influenced the production of these unique textiles. Okay, so piña or nipis textile production was at its peak in the 19th century. In fact, what's interesting is that I compared historical textiles with the textiles that we have now. Now it's more stiff. Before, it's like especially the embroidered ones, it almost feels like lace. So it flows. But today it's very stiff. So further inquiry yielded that actually the soil has changed. So the pH level of soil has changed. And there were attempts also to manufacture or to produce pineapple fabrics in India, because India was one of the biggest manufacturers of textiles. However, the soil again is different. So the main producers of piña is actually in Panay. Okay, so this is really something interesting. What was different about the soil of Panay? That's why we need greater collaboration with scientists, no, in order and scientists and historians in order to look into this further. In 1815, the galleon trade ended. So there was a transition. That's why I began my study with 1820, meaning there was a transition from galleons as the main source of revenues for the colony to agricultural development. There was a shift, meaning they developed cash crops or crops that are not only for domestic consumption but also for exports. And it's by region. By region, there's monocrops, no? It's not to say it's limited to that, but there were main industries. For example, Negros became the main sugar producers. Okay, so next will be the rise of the middle class. With the transition to agricultural development, there was a rise of so-called middle class or new elites, as I would call it. They were fashionable enough, meaning many of them were educated abroad, came back and introduced new Western styles. No, also there were among the local population there was a new sense of cosmopolitanism brought about by um, imports of, for example, periodicals, fashion magazines. Okay, so more on that later. In 1869, the Suez Canal opened, which means it in, reduced travel time to and from Europe. Okay, so there was mobility in terms of people and also mobility in terms of culture and tastes. So that is something very interesting. This is also linked to the development of transportation or the so-called train towns. Okay, because there was mobility not only from Europe to Asia, but also within the Philippines to the different islands, from Manila to the different islands. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let me share with you first the general stages of colonization. We were under Spanish colonial influence for 333 years, and that's quite well known. There's several stages. One is the reconnaissance, invasion, then occupation, and lastly will be assimilation. In the 19th century, there was, can you click please? Can you click please? There was the Ministerio de Ultramar, which was established in 1863, which encouraged cultural and biological assimilation. What do we mean by this? Greater, what do you call this, synergy between the colony and the metropolis. So intermarriages were fostered or were encouraged. Also in schools, especially the ones which were run by Western priests and Western nuns, schools, there were the imposition of uniforms. Okay, so there was really attempts, no, to create some sort of uniformity of ways and which can hopefully influence uniformity of behavior. Next slide, please. When I talked about the Suez Canal opening, there was and the greater mobility between Europe and Asia. I want to show you some of the posters that I found. No, this is Barcelona to Manila in 30 days. Previously, it would take you 3 to 4 months, and only those who are really willing to, to or who were really wanted to travel for 3 to 4 months would take that. Nowadays, we can go from Europe to Asia for in 16 hours. But at the time, it would take 30 days. But that's already the shortened version. Next slide, please. There were a lot of expeditions at the time, and what is interesting is this is Admiral Paris, Edmond Paris. He was French. I looked at his travel route, and he passed by the Philippines. Interestingly, he only passed by Manila, and many times. One of the things I'm working on now are to look at the images, for example, from this expedition, from its perspectives from the sea, because many were painting from the sea. So what they were really painting were just the periphery, not the inland, but rather the coasts, ports. And it's interesting what types of people converged in ports. Okay, you have merchants, you also have priests. So next slide, please. I will show you some examples. So for example, Pont de Manil, this is, again, this is perspective only of the ports or also the coastal areas, and which made the inland life sort of neglected in some sources. Next slide, please. This one is our, as I mentioned, port scenes. This is Manila port scenes. If you look at it closely, what's interesting are the types of people that converged in these places. No, so you would have Chinese merchants, you would have porters, the ones who carry things, and you also would have priests. No, okay. So next slide, please. But what is interesting is the opening of provincial ports and how it influenced, for example, the culture of the region. So in 1855, Iloilo, and then in 1860, Cebu port opened. Okay, so it allowed for direct connection between the outside world and to Europe. So it connected the regions, the provinces to the external world, and was not limited to Manila anymore. Okay, so there were external influences and also imports from England. Of course, it was gradual. It was not immediate. It was not like when the ports opened, suddenly there was massive imports. No, it was gradual. I think in the case of Iloilo or Cebu, it took like 4 years before the imports started to increase. No, next slide, please. Islas Visayas, these are some of the ports I highlighted to you. Provincia de Cebu. Of course, some ports were just smaller ports, no, that accommodated what you would call not imports, but movement of goods, movement of inter-island goods. So these are all I wanted to show you the original text where I found these things. No, so this was from Escobar y Lozano in 1885. It's a travelogue. Not sorry. Not a travelogue, but a travel guide, pretty much like a Lonely Planet nowadays. No? So next slide, please. Islas Visayas Viajes. So I want to show you that there were movement between the islands. Okay, so for example, it would include here how much it cost to go from Manila to Cebu, because goods goods and culture, okay, traveled with people. So the narratives are linked with people, and the clothes are linked to the wearers. So what I'm saying here is that when we're talking about clothes, we're really talking about people and the wearers. Next slide, please. This one, with, as I mentioned, with the goods, there are also shops that opened secondary branches in the provinces. You could see that there was the homogenization, cultural homogenization, as the islands of the Philippines open up to the external world. It also brought goods around the different areas. Not only this, you have Chinese peddlers who would go to the far-flung areas of the Philippines with their carrying goods with their hands. Okay, and then they would distribute their goods. Of course, they're slightly more expensive, but what is interesting is they offered terms. Okay, so you can pay, for example, in 4 gives, as you would call it. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so evolution. The evolution, I will be showing you a lot of images. Some I have not shown before. The variations you will see, the images I will show you would register uh, gender. Okay, so it would be either male or female. I'm sorry, I have to be limited to binary gender because in the 19th century, it's usually male or female. I think there's Kiel Suarez is studying non-normative gender, so I think she would be able to add later on. So this deserves further study. So you would see that the images that I will show would register these things: gender, ethnicity, which region. Oftentimes, there would be captions. Okay, so I will give you some examples, and of course, class. So it would register class consciousness or also class differences. Click, please. So the images fall into different categories. One, you have the individual and the collective, and it's a matter of balancing. Balancing, because one, you have ubiquity. It was pervasive. It was common, but at the same time, there were people who followed their own instincts and who tried to stand out while at the same time to blend in. So there's a uniqueness to it. They embellished their own garments. And you have to remember, this is a period when people wore their art. The art was not simply limited to the homes anymore, but they started to wear it outside. And allow me to share with you, some women, especially the upper class, they would bring an extra piña shirt for parties so that when they dance all night, they start to sweat because, of course, it's very hot in our country. They would have an extra shirt. Okay, so oftentimes it's identical, oftentimes it's entirely different, but it's also a way for them to show off or to show status. Next, we have diversity. So, how do we really study clothing in a broad and plural society? So, there's different classes, there's different regions. How do we really study this? Next, there's some commonality. As I mentioned, the 19th century saw it's a period, it reflected changes, okay, in terms of homogenization. The provinces started to dress like people from Manila. So there's a common denominator that is at play here. You have the shirt started to become identical. So was the skirt. What then were the differences? Usually the materials, the embellishment, the luxury or the opulence of the material, the care that is given to it. No? The upper class, for example, would literally dismantle their shirts and then sew it again. Okay, some would starch it, some would add embroideries, but regardless of the class, the common denominator there is it's still a shirt, it's still a skirt. Okay, the styles will be different. The styles will be more or less similar, but if you look at it closely, there's nuances. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so in the early part of the 19th century, you have straight sleeves. Okay, straight sleeves, the skirt were more or less narrow. I will explain why. Also, if you the collar will also be more square. Okay, then later on they will become rounded. But it does not mean that when you say the clothes evolved, it does not obliterate earlier styles. It's still there. It's just that there's wider variety of styles, of materials that were being used and how they were worn. For example, this pañuelo. How do you really wear this? Some would open it so that it what do you call this, cups the face. Some would starch it so that it's like higher and it's more elegant. So there are different ways of wearing it, and there's nuances actually. Next slide, please. For example, in the 1820s, it's the cut. Okay, it's one piece actually, this one, and the cut is up to below the breast. Okay, so if you notice, the skirts were higher, the sleeves, although it's short sleeves, it's straight also. Then what I want to point out here is that the narrow panel of the skirts. At the time, the looms can only produce narrow panels. So to make skirts, you have to have between 5 to 7 panels. But later on, as the looms were able to make wider textiles, then it made it's possible now to have balloon skirts. It's possible to have trains, no, or saya de cola, as they would call it. Next slide, please. This one, the narrow textile panels, there would be pleats. There would be pleats, but the textile itself, the panels were narrow. Also, the tapis is an overskirt. That is contested because how do you really wear the tapis? Where do you tie them? Do you tie them in the side or at the back? Uh, some upper class refused to wear the tapis because they said it looks like an apron or a wipe where the lower class would wipe their hands while they're selling things. Okay, so many upper class refused to wear this, but of course there's a fashionable way of wearing it. Okay, so for example, if they tie it at the back in the 1840s, they would tie it at the back. In the later on, I think they would tie it in the front. So if you look at it closely, because of the narrow textile panel, the top piece itself, if you look at the material, there would be joinery stitches. So it's not one panel. Rather, it's probably two or three, and it's joined together. It's stitched together. And to cover the stitching, there would be embroideries. Okay, next slide, please. In Ilocos, if you notice the clothing, what are more or less similar. What the difference would be in who was wearing it, what type of materials are they using? Is it the opulent, the expensive textiles? Are they imported textiles, etc.? So there's now a sense of commonality. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this one, I want to show you these two versions because artists, we have to be careful with how we study images because artists often come up with copies of their own works and they just change the textiles. Also, another thing will be the facial features. They would, for example, feature a mestiza or an India, but the faces, they're more or less similar. So they're like paper dolls. You just change the clothes, but the faces are more or less the same. It's just tweaked a little bit. Also, the skin color. So when you cannot modify your facial features in order to, for example, look more mestiza, what people did to show status was to manipulate their external appearance through clothing. Okay, next slide. This is a rare image I wanted to show you because when I mentioned about it being like paper dolls, they have the same body type. This is a rare image of a little bit a woman who has like a little bit of weight. Okay, so this is very rare, and I was quite amazed with that. I found this. I want to show you also that the tapis here was much longer. Okay, later on, it will become shorter. So throughout the 19th century, we cannot put a proper beginning and end date, right? But because the styles kept fluctuating, so it's why because people's tendency to play around with their clothes. So there would be shorter, knee length, and even higher. Okay, so that's the story of the tapis. No? Next slide, please. This one is a sinamayera. What is the indication that she was a sinamayera? One, she's like a shopkeeper, and if you notice, she was holding textiles. And the skirt, it's made of several panels and it's pleated. No? Now, can you click, please? There's from the French expedition, they documented the types of textiles that were being used locally. So this is just the striped version. This is the stripes usually used for tapis, but also for skirts, no? For the saya. So what is interesting is now we can compare what was being used, what the artists painted, scenes of life, scenes of the variety of people that inhabited the Philippines, and then we can compare the materials they used with what's on the what the French documented. Okay, next slide, please. The evolving details, as I mentioned, would be the tempo was different between the upper and the lower garments. They did not evolve at the same time. People, that's why I really highlighted that amid the ubiquity, there's uniqueness. People have their own tempos, have their own cadence. No, so here we have still the straight sleeves, but if you notice, it's becoming wider. It's more comfortable, right? Because people, as women, started to do things, has to started to work, have businesses. Comfort is key. Okay, so I think that's a natural progression that people want to be more comfortable. Okay, so this one, if you notice, the skirt is getting wider. So this is probably 7 panels. Next slide, please. Here you have actually it began in the 1840s. Now, around 1840s, 1860s, you also already see traces of the so-called angel sleeves. So it's becoming wider. I will explain to you later why it became wider, right? Here you have wider also skirts, okay? So which registered that the looms were able to produce wider textile panels. Next slide, please. Okay, here, what's interesting about this image is one, I want you to look at the sleeves of the España Oriental. Okay, so these are criadas or house help. Okay, so this is from Manila Alegre. It's a periodical in the 1880s. No? What I want to show is the angel sleeves. It's wider, but if you notice, it's shorter. It's more comfortable for those who work in the homes or helpers at home or house help. No, so as España Oriental versus España Occidental. In Europe, it's more straight. No, I want to highlight practical things here. In Europe, if it's cold, you wear jacket over it. Therefore, you cannot have this wider sleeves, right? So there's practical adaptations to the tropical climate. Okay, of course, there's it registered also social biases, like the fact that they indicated here that this is how the house help would wear, means that they were there would be some difference with the masters or the lady of the homes. Okay, so there's social biases, there's practical adaptations, also material circumstances. The materials that are being used here in the tropics will be lighter materials as compared to Europe. Although the use of wool, velvet, and brocade was also quite common in the Philippines. Why? Because it's the upper class way of showing their connections to Europe, of showing their status. So it reflects a certain worldliness. So so there was an increase of imports actually of silk, all these materials which were incompatible with the tropical climate. Next slide, please. What is interesting about this reflects this reflects racial bias. So we have here cafe puro, which reflects to the India or natives. We have cafe con leche, the mix, the mestizas, and then others. If you notice the style of the clothes, lo otro are the most probably this refers to the Europeans in the colonies. Okay, so what's the difference? The mestizas, if you notice, they were not wearing any tapis here, which matches with other records that indicates many mestizas refuse to wear the tapis because for them it links them to the house help. Next slide, please. Next slide. All right. So I want to show you the sleeves. If you notice, the upper part is straight, and then it's bell sleeves, right? These bell sleeves, it registered the needlework skills that the women were the needlework skills of the women at the time. The periodicals also started to display different types of embroideries, which you would find if you look at these garments. These garments would often have subtle embroideries indicating names or other types of designs, floral, celestial patterns. Okay, if you notice, the skirt became wider, and in some cases they added petticoats. Okay, next slide, please. Here, this is 1880. So you have the bell sleeves coexisting with the angel sleeves. Okay, so here you have already the skirt is silk, it's wider, so, and it also has a train. So this is not something you would typically wear if you are running errands in escolta, because it will sweep up all the all the dirt. So this is something you would wear for a photograph session or for a tertulia, not even for a paseo or a walk. No, so this is typically something you would wear indoors. Next slide, please. This one is actually Leonor Rivera. This is a photo of Leonor Rivera. Take a look again at the bell sleeves this time. Okay, so if you notice, it's lower because of the panuelo. That's why in the upper part, it's straight. Okay, so it became wider, because it's more practical. You can just move more. Second, the needlework skills. Women wanted to display their art, so they would embellish the sleeves. They're starching. And then this is a period where fashion was worn and not simply hanged at home. Next slide, please. Now, this one is Pakil and Pateros. No? So this one from a different social class. So if you notice, there will be a delay in fashionability. Why? Because the lower classes have less resources to be fashionable. They would probably have one set for special occasions, but their daily wear are more or less, it's more or less more common, more simple, more practical. Next slide, please. Okay, again, if you notice, there will be a change from the earlier images I showed you. This reflects people from a different background. Okay, you also have them where the images are enlivened with tools of their trade. So, for example, here you have the broom. The other one, although they would have bakya, okay, some would have no shoes, etc. So that's how artists rendered class, no, in images. Next, please. Next slide, please. Here we have sellers, fruit sellers. In the case of the first image on the left, you have chicken, no? So they would sell chicken. Also, you can see the wider textile panels, the translucency of the material for the upper garments. No? So here we have comfort is key. So many times you would see them having looser sleeves. Why? Because they're ambulant, so they go around. So it has to be more comfortable. Next slide, please. All right, these are trajes de lutos vis-a-vis church attire. We have the trajes de luto. You would see the veil, which is either in crimson red or Bordeaux red. Okay, and the one for the church, they also wear the same thing. So more or less, the trajes de luto is the darker version of what people normally wear to church. Okay, for church-going attire, you would also see some images with children, and the children are, especially some female children would wear the younger version of what their moms are wearing. So they're like little ladies, as you would call it. And there's an entire literature on the types of stockings that they would use especially for unmarried women. So from adolescents to from children to adolescents, they would wear a particular stockings or yeah. Next slide, please. So men's clothing, Inhabitants of Manila. Can you click, please? This one would show in the 1800s. This is from the late 1800s. It's very European. the men wore stockings, the pants were shorter, they would wear ruffles. Okay, so it's more European. But in the 19th century, you would see a shift of a combination, so you would call a hybrid. Next slide, please. So here this is a Damian Domingo painting, which is between 1820 to 1835. If you notice, the pants were still shorter. And of course, this is worn by people from a different social class, okay? From a lower social class, more comfort was key. Next slide, please. Now contrast that with clothing of those in authority. So this is standard wear for people from our authority figures. They would wear a hat, which was usually given to them by their predecessor. In some instances, there would be a cane, which would be presented to them by their constituents. And the jacket, they would have to have it made themselves. There's official sastres or tailors that would make these types of shirt. And then the saya, the pants, there are Chinese silk embroidered at the bottom that I suspect were made specifically for the Philippine market. Okay? And then the shirt underneath, it's like our barong, no? But it's a typical barong. Usually that's translucent, and then you would wear a jacket over it. It's a bit of a strange combination, but it's what it's what the people who were in authority, gobernadorcillos, cabezas de barangay would typically wear. Next slide, please. This one is a dandy. If you notice, it's the combination is very strange, but dandies are worth looking into. They are people who did not really care what people thought about them. They were more free. And if you notice, he was wearing ruffled shirts, and the way he held his cane, there's something effeminate about it. Okay, so there's a sense of this freedom-loving people who crossed borders between the classes. So they were more fluid in terms of their dressing styles. And the closest I can think of is they're the 19th century version of metrosexual. Okay, next slide, please. This is from the 1880s. But what's interesting about this image is it looks very much like what we would see now. So the silhouette of the barong was already similar to what was worn in the 1880s, 1890s. Okay, so I hashtag it Titos of Manila because it reminds me of present-day Titos of Manila. Okay, so next slide, please. So individual and collective. So the habit in Inhabitants of the Philippines, you have it identified here: Negritos, no, Moros, Indios, Igorots, Chinese, Mestizos, and Europeans. So these are the different groups that inhabited the Philippines. No, next slide, please. So sorry, go back, please. And then you have the dialects also. So you have Visayas, Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, etc. Next slide. What is interesting with this is from the census in 1885. No, the most inhabitants were from Cebu, 357,000. Manila, 314. Batangas, 313. That's very interesting because the inhabitants would mean, looking at them, which provinces had the most people and therefore the most material to study for clothing, right? So the clothing culture of the regions are really, it deserves its own study. Okay, so Cebu, I wish I could one day visit the archives there and see what you have. Right now, I was using more of the European archives, primarily because I was studying here in Europe. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have the tipos del país. You have the variety of tipos del país or Philippine types. There will be similar ones in India. Okay, so here we have the different, it reflects not only different livelihood, different occupations, but also different classes. No? So next slide. For example, this contrast, this image. This one is an agodero. He's the one that delivers water. Okay, on the right side, you have a gobernadorcillo and constable. So what happened here? Hello. You um, Here in this image, you can see that those in authority were wearing different types of garments from, for example, the agoderos or the other ambulant vendors who would be dressed similarly, usually for comfort. Next slide, please. What I want to point out here, in the 19th century, the women's clothing. So if you notice, I'm starting to show you pairs. Uh, the skirt started to incorporate floral, celestial patterns. The also became wider. Okay, meaning there's strains now. And this one, it's a what I love about this image is the men, the man and the woman. The men, they have variety of costumes, the variety of clothing. There's for fiestas, for business, for leisure. So actually, the 19th century was defined by men's fashions. It's really more interesting than women's fashion because women's fashion, it was more problematized, more analyzed and studied, but the men's fashion registered more differences. Next slide, please. So this one, it's an all women, it's a tertulia. Oftentimes the men would be out smoking or would be in another part of the house. This is an example of close proximity where you could see the details of the clothes in close proximity. So oftentimes women would wear more elegant clothes because they knew they would be viewed in closer in closed areas. No, next slide, please. In Iloilo, you also have, with the opening of ports, there were consulates and also trading houses that opened. So there were foreigners. So you can see here Europeans living in Iloilo. And then you have their cochero, which was wearing an all white. Now, I want to distinguish between clothing and costume. Costumes are those that were worn similar, like uniforms. They were worn for representation, okay, or as the job would dictate. Next slide. Here, Inhabitants of Manila. This is from, again, Edmond Paris. He would, what I want to show you here is the barong. At some point, it was very long. It was like the Indian kurta. Okay, and then through the years, it shortened. Okay, and on the left, you also have the lower class version of a raincoat. Okay, so it's made of like this palm. It's also, fishermen would also use that. Next slide, please. This one is a town hall meeting. If you notice, they're all dressed similarly. The men are all, these are persons in authority during an election. Okay, so in the earlier 1840s, it's very colorful. But through the years, the colors that the men would wear would become more somber or muted. Next slide, please. Here, it's a family. What's interesting about this is the father surrounded by the women in the family. It contrasts that men are in Western suit, that the man is in a Western suit, and the women are in native clothing. You know what they say, that it's the women that represented the nation. Okay, next slide, please. Social spaces, I'm almost done, don't worry. Social spaces are places where you can see a variety of people converge, similar to the port areas I was showing. I showed you earlier. This one is a sari-sari store. Next slide, please. And this one again is a sari-sari store. So it gives you, it's an interesting point, it's an interesting image to analyze because you would think what types of people converge in these areas. So the social spaces of the upper class would be way different from the social spaces of the lower classes. No? Next slide. Here you have, again, street scenes. Fighting cocks, okay, are very important elements of street scenes. And what's interesting about this is you have children, depiction of children. Oftentimes, the upper class, they would be dressed in Western wear, fully clothed with stockings, where the lower classes often had no pants on. Okay, so these types of images where there's a convergence of people are very interesting because they capture a moment in time where people converged. Next slide, please. This one is women fighting. If you notice, the clothes were torn. Okay, so it also depicts difference not only in culture but also in the way people conducted themselves. Okay, so the messy, torn. Okay, it's a behavioral thing. No, so that's why clothing can be also studied from a psychological point of view. Next, please. Here, it's a pansiteria. You would see the child, for example, an indicator that she's perhaps a beggar is because she had no clothes, she has no shoes on, and she was trying to tap from people eating. So again, you will see the Chinese with Manchu hairstyle. Okay, where it's bald here, and then you have the pigtail at the back. Okay, so again, this is an example of an image that I used that depicts the convergence of people and how the link between the space and how people dressed. Next slide, please. Okay, so there were the changes. To summarize the changes, there were formal education. Okay, formal education affected how people dressed and how people conducted themselves. Greater mobility, Europe to Asia, also between Manila and the provinces. So connections to Europe through ports. Leisure time started to change. The social spaces also reflects how people spent their leisure time, where they ate, where they go shopping, etc. The material resources also started to change. For example, the looms started to produce wider textiles. You have taste and attitudes of people were influenced by education or also by their peers, by their friends. Okay, then class distinction. Okay, so people were becoming more conscious, especially the ones who were, for example, from Europe. They were eager to show their status. Okay, next slide, please. So cosmopolitanism, does it mean that if it's a European style, it's more cosmopolitan? In the case of the Philippines, what's interesting is the hybrid, the combination of Western elements or the addition of Western elements to native clothing. So from those in authority, you saw the barong being worn with the Western jacket, right? It's what's cosmopolitan in our context. Next slide, please. Okay, so ubiquity, there was a pervasiveness, there was a commonality, but also people individually tried to establish their distinction. They tried to be different. And theatricality, you will see it in all sorts of ways, no? In production, punishment, and death. Theatricality, I will show you in the next slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so you have theatricality in production. Sometimes they would weave in the streets as a means of showing how these things are made. Okay, how the textiles are woven. Next slide, please. Also, this one, this is a guy was being brought to probably the mayor. Okay, and then you will see the barefooted, and then you have the mayor, and actually the painting there would be Isabella II. You will see the different types of people that converged here. This is linked to the next slide. Next slide, please. Where for punishments, it's usually public, and the hangman, they would usually be dressed in red, so they stand out. So I've read this. I tried to confirm the images with the text, and indeed it's true. So there's a certain theatricality to public punishments as a way to deter future criminals. Or yeah, next slide, please. Again, this is a procession for not procession for a saint, but a burial of a child. You would see how people are dressed. One thing I want to show here, actually, the one here is not the one. The Santo Niño there is not a Santo Niño. It's the dead child. So they are paraded around wearing clothes of saints, and sometimes they sometimes they would actually fall, the corpse would fall. So it's a very strange tradition of displaying the child like practically like in a cake, no, but the dead child in a cake. So but this is interesting for how it reflects the theatricality in the Philippines, no? That they parade through town, there's music. It's almost like some would have happy tunes even. Okay, so these are some of the theatricality in our local culture. Next slide, please. This one is more solemn. Okay, this is for adults. And if you notice, probably of an important person, as you can see, the ones with the short jackets are people of men of authority. Next slide, please. These are the principales, which was reflected in the other slide. What I wanted to show here is that uh, when we're working with images, we really have to cross-reference the images with the text. That's the way to do research in a proper way. Thank you. Next slide, please. I think the archives and sources, I will just skip, okay, because it's getting too long. We will just go to the last where it says thank you. Go on, please. Okay, so thank you very much. I think I will stop there because it's getting too long. So daghang salamat. Maayong hapon Visayas, maayong hapon Cebu. If you need to get in touch with me, if you have any questions, I wrote there my email. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Koo, for the lecture. No worries, ma'am. Even if you extended a bit, it would have been very fine still. But we are going to have, if it's okay with you, ma'am, a few questions. Maybe if we can entertain a few
Of
questions for
course.
our Q&A. All right. But before anything else, we just like to mention, because we have actually invited the public school teachers of our region to this webinar, and we'd like to just mention them who actually are here this afternoon to watch our webinar. DepEd Danao City, DepEd Talisay City, DepEd Pinamungahan, DepEd Toledo City, DepEd Bogo, St. Cecilia's College. I know who from this college is, and I think he's very familiar to you, ma'am. Hi to William, actually, William De Gracia. And we have also from Don Sergio Osmeña High School, the Cebu City, from Bai City, we also have them, the teachers there. Tagbilaran City, Division, of whole division. Chris, I'm not so, okay, I hope I pronounce this correctly. AMRCES, AMCES. Santa Catalina, District 2, Division of Negros Oriental. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon in this webinar. I think we have a few questions actually lined up for Dr. Koo, but before that, I was really very interested, ma'am, with the with that very peculiar practice you mentioned at the end about the
Yes.
dead child. But
Yeah.
hopefully it's not done anymore today.
Yeah.
I don't know. There are, well, anyway, but you mentioned about theatricality, ma'am, and we can
Mm-hmm.
see that in shown actually in certain customs, and there were practices that we did. Was this also shown in clothing, the theatricality? It's not just in the production, but in the way we clothe ourselves. Was it
Of
there
course.
also?
Yes, because not only in the images, but also in the text, in the descriptions, they would say that people dress to see and be seen. Because, di ba, Pinoys, we are people watching,
Yeah.
right? So, because we do people watching, so people really dress to impress. And even the Sunday wear, right? The Sunday wear. And what is interesting is that the lower classes, sometimes kahit hindi nila kaya, they will spend money just for clothes. Sometimes 1 month salary just for clothes. So the Filipinos really want to dress well, right?
Yeah.
And it shows, in the records that whether you're from the upper or the lower class, there's this desire to dress well. Yeah.
And that is
So
still very much practiced today, ma'am. No, people even in going to church are dressed to be seen. And you
yes,
also mentioned about cosmopolitanism, about
yes,
how in our case that we add the Western influence, Western styles to our native clothing. It's also very much evident in our art, for even in
Mm-hmm.
our architecture, ma'am. The churches,
Yes. Oo.
uh, although in Western style, but we add our native elements in them. So
Mm-hmm.
that's very interesting. It's also seen in our clothing, in our dresses. Very interesting.
Oo.
Mom, we have our first question.
Question.
Can
Mm-hmm.
we have
Of
it
course.
posted, please?
Yes,
Okay.
of
Here's the
course.
first question, ma'am. This is from Vince Joaquino, and he's asking,
Mm-hmm.
are there any records where Filipinos, especially the higher class, acquire clothing trends from Europe and the Americas, especially during the Victorian era, where dresses and suits symbolize social status? And the second question is how foreigners, diplomats, and even the locals react on each other because of their different clothing. Maybe that there are two
Yes.
questions there, mom. Maybe you can just tell us which one you want to answer, or maybe you can answer both.
Yes. Yes, of course. Yung Victorian era, even the color palette, even it became darker, di ba? Yung colors. Before kasi, it's more, if you notice, ang colorful. But later on, it became more somber. So it became more muted, both in men and women. In men
Mm,
and women's clothing. And then the upper class also, makikita mo to with the Filipinos who were living abroad because they were the ones who were most likely wearing European style garments, but they would add native touches. One example would be the wife of Juan Luna, si Paz Pardo de Tavera. She
Rivera.
was wearing a lot of the Victorian style, which she designed herself actually.
Mm,
Oo, and then there would be just native touches. Because one thing, it's also the space we're in. So if we're living in the Philippines, of course we would be more likely to blend in with the crowd. But if we're in Europe, we have to blend in Europe also. So imagine Rizal wearing barong in Europe. He would wear it for special occasions, but not for everyday wear. So that's the importance of the link between our social space and our milieu, our context with the way we dress. And also there are other things like time of day, occasion, event, 'di ba? Merong gala wear. So what are you going to wear to a gala? What are you going to wear to a theater? So I gave an earlier talk for Ecomos on the link between spaces and clothing. So yes, there are many indicators of European trends being adopted by upper class Filipinos and later on also by the lower class Filipinos, especially recipients of hand-me-down
down,
clothes.
yeah.
'Di ba? So ayaw na ni Madam, so ibibigay, 'di ba? And then so there's a delay among the lower classes. There's a delay in the way they adopted the trends. But later on, the trends will always also be diffused because nga may binibigay, they're
Mm.
hand-me-downs. Oo. All right. So what was the second question?
Can we flash the question again? All right. Okay.
Second question was how okay. So there were American diplomats, for example, who started to wearing the short jacket and then the shirt and then the checkered pants like I showed you earlier, men, no? Why? Because it's one of the ways by which they can endear themselves to the local population. 'Di ba? Imagine mo ngayon, let's say Quentin Tarantino or Joe Biden wearing the barong. 'Di ba? Right? Or Barack Obama wearing the barong, you would also feel like, oh, it's so nice. It's a nice gesture. So the same way at the time, there were Spanish governor generals who wore Philippine clothing as a way to endear themselves to the local population.
Yeah.
Yes. So I hope, Vince, I answered your question.
Dr. Ko, I have probably an additional question actually,
Yes.
because you mentioned about the hand-me-downs to say to the house helps, uh,
Aha.
eh, and probably because the style has already gone out, so and then parang late nga sila to
Mhm.
adapt. But you mentioned also somewhere in your lecture, ma'am, that the helps also because of the kind of work that they did tried to be practical also with their clothes. So did they also make changes, and how far can they make the changes?
Uh, Now that's the question about costume, because there are some which are costumed for their jobs. 'Di ba? Parang if for example you're parang uniform siya for a hotel, for example.
Mm.
'Di ba? So there's specific attires that you have to wear, right?
Oh.
Oo, pero that's a costume. Pero for in our case naman, may ganun din na yan yung dapat suotin mo for your job. But yung mga
Mm-hmm.
house help, sometimes they just modify. Even the cocheros, they would modify their clothes while they're waiting for their clients.
Mm.
Oo, so sometimes kasi hand me down nga, ipapaliitin nila, palalakihin nila, and then for those on the job, uh, syempre you have to think first of comfort. It has to be practical. So they can modify but not too much. Now it looks entirely different. 'Di ba? It would
Mm-hmm.
still look the same but it would more or less be more comfortable. And as long as visually, 'di ba? It's not so discernible. Okay? Oo.
Mm.
So may ganong mga ano. And then a lot of these images are for Filipinos working for foreigners. Because parang naka-uniform sila. It
Mm-mm.
looks still like the saya and stuff, but some are provided for. Binibilhan sila ng tela, pinapagawan sila because that's like their uniform for their job.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Thank you,
did I
ma'am.
answer? Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Well, so we can let Doctor take a break for a little while. We'll have one. We'll incorporate our trivia questions.
Okay.
Maybe we can have our first one now. This is our first trivia question. The first one who answers this in the comment section wins a prize. So our first trivia question is: this is the part of the piña which is used to create the fiber. No, and Dr. Ku mentioned about uh, that you know it's a part that we don't usually use, so or eat, or it's useful for us. So fast fingers, if you know the answer, just comment them in our comment section, and then the first one who gets the right answer will be given a prize. Okay, I think yes. Is all right. Let's have our second question. Um, we will be announcing the winner if we have a winner later on. No? So, but this is a question from June Lee, Arthur 111. Dr. Ko, does the tapis have pre-colonial roots? Because it seems similar to pre-colonial female clothing documented by the Spanish.
Hello. Yes, definitely, because the tapis, yes, it has already been there, but the way it was used changed during the 19th century. Meaning of the way it was used is it became a class indicator. If you note, a class and race. If you notice, the mestizas did not want to wear it.
Yes.
'Di ba? So in fact, there's a term called aristocracia de tapis, because it reflects that the aristocrats supposedly did not want to wear the tapis.
Oh,
Oo.
okay.
So, yeah, oo, mga aristocrats ayaw daw kasi it makes it look more native. 'Di ba? It looks more native if you add the tapis. Without the tapis,
Mm.
it just looks like a European balloon skirt.
Mm.
Right? Yeah, but with the addition of the tapis, with the distinct patterns, 'di ba? Then it looks really like it becomes an identifying mark. Identifying mark of Philippineness, in other words. Yes. So, yes, it has uh if you think about it, the tapis kasi, it's just a piece of cloth. It's not even sewn. It's sewn in the edges. But it's free flowing, para siyang patajong, if you think
Mm.
about it, right? It's like a patajong. So these things have always, it's there. It's just the way you now use it. 'Di ba? It's like you have a piece of cloth. What do you do with that? right? That's where individual choice comes in. 'Di ba? Because if you think about it, the tapis piece of cloth lang yan eh. So how are you going to use that? 'Di ba? Some actually use the tapis in a way na parang after, so it's a garment that is versatile. You can also use it, the longer version, you can use it also for bathing.
Hmm.
Yung mga naliligo, oo, after parang tapis, 'di ba? It's a cover, right? So of course it has always been there. It's just the way you use it, how you use it, how you fashion it, 'di ba? That's what changed. The
It,
tapis, yun yung sinusuot after yun na maligo ka eh. 'Di ba?
oh,
Tapis,
in
yeah.
Cebu, we call it still tapis.
Tapis,
Top,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, but the fact that it was incorporated in what do you call this? Parang party wear. 'Di ba? Pina-shorten lang tapos sinusuot siya as party wear. 'Di ba? So from something that you use habang naliligo to something you use to a party, that's a big leap, right? So it's really 'di ba? It's really how the wearers choose to wear this material or how to use this material. Oo. Kasi it's a free-flowing material. It's a free-flowing piece of cloth.
But it did not originate from, say, you as it's used as an apron, ma'am, or a sort of like a covering because maybe the cloth is transparent, or
Yung sa
was that
skirt,
how it started?
um, no eh. Kasi the skirt, if you notice, ginagawa siya sa skirt. Yung dinadagdag sa skirt, di ba? It's an
Mm,
overskirt, right? The overskirt, yung skirt underneath it, the saya, it's not transparent eh.
mhm,
It's not transparent. So, most probable, it evolved from being used as an apron.
mm,
So, even possibly lower class origins. Kasi ginagawa siya, 'di ba, when you're let's say selling, 'di ba? Meron ka, you need a wipe eh. Kailangan mo
mm,
mag-wipe.
mm,
So, that's how it could have originated. Oo. And then later on, it evolved as a fashionable piece. Kasi pag may added kang ganyan, alam mo anong maganda sa tapis? Because if you have a skirt underneath, tapos may tapis ka, you can tighten it. 'Di ba? You can tighten it. So,
mm.
maganda yung figure. 'Di ba? So, it accentuates the waist. 'Di ba? It shows off the hips. So, parang it became a piece of garment that can now make your attire more fashionable. Oo. Yeah. So,
That's
ganon.
very interesting. Thank you
Mm-mm.
for answering the question, ma'am, and thank you
Oo.
for Junlee Arthur 111, who is actually also our first trivia winner.
Oh,
Congratulations.
congratulations.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's have our trivia number two, and then we can have we still have more questions from Dr. Koo. Let's have first
Okay.
this the second trivia question. This is
Mhm.
the second. Fast fingers again. Blank were used to cover stitching. Um, and I think Dr. Koo mentioned this, but I hope you remember. And so, if you get the right answer to our question, our trivia question, you will get the prize. So, while waiting for our winner, let's go to the third question. If we still have a third question, yeah, okay.
What is the price, may I ask?
It's usually from an item, or our gift, our items from the Casa Gordo Museum shop, which is
Okay.
actually,
Yeah.
yeah, they're very actually nice because they're also how do you call this, kind of specialized talaga. And
Oh,
it's really, you can usually find them only in few stores, but definitely in the Casa Gordo Museum, this is like
okay.
uh, kind of unique. We sell actually
Unique things.
items unique, yeah. And very
Okay.
much Cebuano, of course. Let's have our third question for Dr. Koo. Okay. From John Paul Igalin Abellera, thank you for your question. Are there colonial clothing from the Philippines that reached other areas in East and Southeast Asia, like Macau or present-day Indonesia? What was there an exchange of influences? Two questions there, ma'am.
Yes. Um, Definitely. If you notice the patterns, the stripe patterns, pare-pareho yan sa Southeast Asia eh.
Mm.
Right? And okay, let's start with East Asia, so China. Napakita ko yung skirt, yung saya-saya. It's this parang wide pants with embroidery at the bottom. If you
Can
notice.
can we find that?
Yeah, the saya-saya. That was produced specifically for the Philippine market in China. Kasi sa China, hindi siya fashionable, pero sa Philippines, fashionable. So it's like, di ba may mga products tayo that we produce mainly for exports?
Mhm.
Yeah. And then second, yung Indonesia, okay, India muna, sorry. China and India muna. India naman, the baro at saya. Originally, the baro is very short. It's like the Indian na makikita mo yung stomach.
Oh.
Or the original idea for the baro is influenced by the Indian clothing, which is short. Tapos at the time, wala pang bra. So that's what I mentioned about the breast panel. Okay, so hanggang dito lang yan, under the breast. So even if, that's why if you lift your shirt, makikita mo na yung breast kasi it was very short. It was later on that it became longer. Oh, why? Because we're a Catholic society. So modesty is key. And since transparent siya, kaya din kailangan sumuot ng panuelo. Because the panuelo is an added modesty panel, as you would call it. Mm-mm. And then it became a showpiece kasi with the panuelo you can embroider it, pwede ka mag-show off ng embroidery skills, etc. 'Di ba? So it became a showpiece. Now, yung Southeast Asia, yung parehos dyan sa atin will be for the indigenous tribes also, the color palettes, the design, mga ikat design, the techniques, the dyeing techniques, mas makikita mo yan common among our indigenous tribes. And of course, there will be an intermingling of influences. Meron yan because I'll give you an example. Indonesia is so close to the Philippines. So is Macau. Diba? And Macau kasi was under the Portuguese. That's what I'm actually studying now. What were the exchanges between Macau and Manila? Diba? Tayo, Spanish Philippines. Yung Macau was under the Portuguese. Okay? So, what's interesting is ano yung mga commonality? Ano yung mga exchanges, right? So, there will be, when you speak of clothing is influenced by thought. Our thought influence our choices, right? So, ideas. Before you look at clothing, you look at what ideas about the world were exchanged. Right? So what I did was I compared the way the Spanish colonies were run by the Spaniards and how the Portuguese run their colonies. Right? As a Philippines kasi dito yung mga all officials that were sent were not trained. Many were not trained. Only the top officials were really trained. Some were mga parang patapon of the society that were thrown to the colonies. Oo. Yung iba naman, yung sa Portugal, they sent those who were really interested in trade. So makikita mo, they were focusing on, for example, they will document textiles, they will document products. Why? With the intention of reproducing it. Diba? That's one of the ways by which they acquired information para ma-reproduce nila. I'll give you another example. There's an Indian textile trader in the Philippines named Daniel Baboom. Si Daniel Baboom, he was living in the Philippines. He commissioned Damian Domingo to draw these Philippine types with focus on textiles. Why? He's selling textiles . So obviously, gusto niya may tao. Lang naman textile lang. Gusto niya may tao na nakasuot ng textiles niya. 'Di ba? Para siyang catalog. Right? So these are some of the sources that we can use to study clothing.
Yeah. Bongga naman yung catalog niya, ma'am, painting talaga ni Damian Domingo.
Yes, oo, bongga, 'di ba? Oo, maganda actually yung ano niya. Oo, yung catalog na yon kasi it documents, it's not a catalog but it's a Philippine types. But if you notice, the intention behind it is
Yeah.
really as a catalog for his business.
Yes, to sell.
Oo, to
Something like
sell,
that.
'di ba? Oo. So these are examples naman of Indian traders in the Philippines. 'Di ba? So in
Mm.
terms of exchanges of ideas, yes, definitely there were exchanges of ideas between the places around East, South, Southeast Asia. Mm-mm.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am, for answering that question. Yeah.
Okay.
We have one more question, and before that, of course, we'll insert first our third trivia question. We're still confirming whether we have a winner for our second trivia question. But
Mhm.
here's our third trivia question. Fast fingers now. If you want to get a prize, here's our third trivia question. This is the darker version of the church attire worn by Indios. Okay, there were three actually that Dr. Koo mentioned. Parang may ranges, parang of the colors. No? So here's the darker version. So what was the darker version? Fast fingers now, and let's go to our third question and third and last question for Dr. Koo. Okay, here it is. From our Alta Moda. Hi, Dr. Ku. When do you think the Creoles and Indios started wearing undergarments? When Filipinas added undergarments in their daily clothing.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yes, this is very interesting, no? Because okay. So first, I'll define yung Creoles. Who are the Creoles? Creoles are the Spanish who were born in the Philippines. Creoles were the original Filipinos. Kasi Filipinos, because yung mga Spanish from Spain called the Spanish born in the Philippines as Filipinos. Sila yung original Filipinos, right? Can we
Mm-mm.
flash the question just so I can break it down?
Bring
Uh,
back the question, please. Okay.
Yes. So that's the origin. The Creoles were the original Filipinos. Indios were the so-called native inhabitants, no? And then we have the mestizos, which are the mixed, right? Okay. So when did they start wearing garments, undergarments? Um, it will it will not be possible to put an exact date. Okay. And when you say undergarments, it evolved also. Remember the breast panels I
Yes.
mentioned? It was sewn with the baro. It's sewn like it's just a rectangular piece. 'Di ba? It's a rectangular piece, but that's the earlier version of the bra.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a rectangular piece na tinahi. It actually looks awkward. Kasi, di ba, transparent. Tapos may
Yun nga.
rectangle dyan. Di ba? So, it looks very awkward. So, but that appeared in the 1820s. Right? In the 1820s. So, by the mga 1830s, makikita mo na may kamison. Why?
Mm.
It's a natural progression. It's a natural evolution. Why? Because transparent yung garments natin eh. So, kailangan talaga may undergarment. 'Di ba? And it came in varying forms. For the men, kikita mo yung barong, you wear a t-shirt underneath. For the women, for their baro, they wear a kamison. 'Di ba? Why
Mm-mm.
kamison and not t-shirt? Because it looks na yung babae naka-t-shirt, 'di ba? It doesn't look good. So you, right? So the undergarments, it's a balance also of aesthetics, how it would look or how it will interact with the outer garment. 'Di ba? So that's why. So mga 1830s makikita mo may mga kamison na, 'di ba?
Mm-mm.
And then in the 1840s actually meron ng petticoats. Eh, di ba, the material for petticoat is itchy, which means you also need cotton undergarments. Do you see? So, para siyang, it's not so much na, it's a necessity. Di ba? The undergarments were in fact a necessity of, of the outer garments. Di ba nga sabi nila, if you wear the wrong undergarments now, kunwari, naka-lace ka, lace undergarments, tapos lace bra, and then you're wearing a t-shirt na body fit, syempre you will see, di ba? So it has to be, you have to wear the right undergarment for the outer garments. No? So
Correct. Yeah.
there has to be that balance, no? So makikita mo, um, the clothing nung 19th century, ilang layers yan. Imagine mo, you have the underwear kasi magpa-petticoat ka. Tapos may stockings pa yan. 'Di ba? Then my skirt. And then there's a tapis if they choose to wear a tapis.
Mm.
Upper garment naman, you have the camisón, right? And then if you're asking about the bra itself, I cannot answer that exactly when yung bra sinuot sa Philippines. Okay? But I can give indicators of what we wear under the transparent baro. Okay? So it evolved from a rectangular piece to a camisón. Tapos, with that, outside you have the baro, and then you have the pañuelo. So if you notice, that's 4 layers.
Oh
Three to
gosh.
four layers. Oo, 3 to 4 layers. So, sabihin nila the Philippine garments are light. Actually, mainit yung barong ha. Mainit yung material ng pinya. 'Di ba? Mainit siya eh. So, even the husi, it's not it's not light. It's
Mm.
kinda mainit siya. No, lalo na tropical tayo. Imagine
Okay.
wearing those in the theater. Wala namang
Oh,
aircon sa theater at the time, 'di ba? Na may mga velvet curtains. Why? So that's when this is linked to earlier what I said about the status game. So kahit mainit na, they're perspiring under layers of clothing. Sige, tiis ganda. Tiis ganda, why? Because they want to show their status, 'di ba? Yeah, so yes, in the Philippines, tiis ganda.
thank you, ma'am, for
Oo.
telling us about that. That's just, oh gosh, if you, in this kind of weather here or climate here, ma'am, that would be very difficult. Actually, I cannot imagine how our for our ancestors were able to stand wearing how many layers of clothing and in this kind of climate. Oh gosh. Anyway,
But
yes, ma'am.
I'm sure sa mga Flores de Mayo or mga ano natin, 'di ba kahit mga sinulog na mga attire na 'yon, yung mga costume, tiis ganda 'yan. 'Di ba? Kasi
Yes.
sa sobrang init, pero sige, suotin pa rin kahit gaano ilang layers ng ruffles.
So the word is ganda started in their time pa, ma'am.
No, no.
No, the idea.
Yeah, the
Okay.
idea. Oo.
Thank
Yes.
you very much for answering the
Oo.
question. And thank you for
Okay.
those who gave us their questions. But we'd like to also announce that we have our winner for trivia number 2, and that is Elma Dasian. Congratulations. We even have our third trivia winner, and that's Davri Caro. Congratulations. And our GSK organizing committee team will reach out to you so that you'll be told how to be able to get the prizes for winning our trivia. Daghang salamat kayo for those who gave their questions, and of course daghang salamat to Dr. Stephanie Koo for
Thank
the
you.
accepting our invitation to speak to our webinar this afternoon. Very interesting. I hope, ma'am, in the next GSKs, and because you have, I know, other studies still about clothing, you will still be welcoming of our invitation, ma'am.
Yes, definitely. Oo. Thank you
And
very much, for having me. And I'm happy kasi before the pandemic, we only give lectures in, within the four walls of our classroom. But nowadays, it parang I am able to share my research to mga teachers, no, in different provinces, different islands
yes.
natin. Oo. So I'm happy that at least the fruits of my research, nagtrabaho na rin ako, so might as well share it, 'di ba? So, yeah.
But ma'am, we also would like to congratulate you for the book, your first book,
Thank you.
winning actually the
Uh,
prize, and you bested actually a lot of the finalists
ah,
there.
thank you.
Congratulations,
Thank
ma'am.
you very much. Oo. Thank you
And
so
because
much.
we're so appreciative of Dr. Koo accepting our invitation to speak in our webinar this afternoon, we'd like to give to her our certificate of appreciation. Can we flash it, please?
Oh,
This
thank you.
certificate of appreciation is given to Dr. Stephanie Mariko for sharing her expertise and time as resource speaker of the webinar Ubiquity, Uniqueness, and the Theatricality of 19th-century Philippine Clothing during the Gabii sa Kabilin 2021 online activity for September, given this 24th of September 2021 at the Kabilin Center here in Cebu City, signed by Rafi President and CEO Ms. Amaya Aboitiz Fansler. Thank you very much, ma'am. And
Thank you.
I know you had to wake up quite early there in Portugal.
No, it's okay. It's
And
okay.
with good luck actually, ma'am, to your researches. I know you have many actually in the pipeline, and I hope you win another award for the probably second book. I know it's in the offing probably. And so, ma'am, again, daghang salamat actually from Cebu, from us here at the Ramon Aboitiz Foundation and the Gabii sa Kabilin.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for those who answered the trivia questions and participated. Thank you. Maraming
Thank,
salamat. Oo.
thank you, ma'am. We'll have the certificate sent actually to you, ma'am. Thank you. And
Okay.
with that, we'd like to thank also our Gabii sa Kabilin partners for 2021. And we'd also like, of course, to thank the JSK Organizing Committee composed of Melka Rave, Renren, Mardel Sig, Verla, and Mac, ably assisted by our Stakeholder Management Officer, Chad, who is our link to the DepEd and the private schools. And that is why we have teachers actually joining us this afternoon. I'd like to remind our audience to that there's still the remaining two trivia questions. So if you want to get a prize, watch out for our remaining two trivia questions, which we will be posting right after this webinar. We'd also like to remind everyone who would like to get an e-certificate to please answer our evaluation. The link will be posted also after our webinar, and we will be closing and get you rid of that link at 11:59 tonight. So you have only a few hours to answer the evaluation if you want to get the e-certificate. And of course, we still have our October activity for Gabii sa Kabilin online activities, and it's going to be different for October because it will be a quiz ball, and this quiz ball will be for our senior high school students in Cebu City and in Mandaue City. But nevertheless, if I think we can learn a lot from this quiz ball. So please stay tuned for the last Friday of October. That's when our Palistuhay quiz ball on Cebuano culture and heritage will happen. And this will be brought to you by the Casa Gordo Museum. And we'd like to thank everyone who has joined us this afternoon in our webinar. Daghan kayong salamat. Hinaot dili mo makuano kanang magpadayon gyapon mo og appeal sa atong mga webinar ug ato ang mga kalihukan sa Gabii sa Kabilin online. And with that, we'd like to say goodbye everyone, and definitely please stay safe, and if you haven't gotten yourself vaccinated yet, do get the vaccinated. Bye everyone. Thank you. Maayong hapon.
Thank you so much for sharing your valuable time and for participating in our webinar today. We hope to see you again next month for another Gabii sa Kabilin online activity to appreciate and experience Cebu's culture and heritage. Please don't forget to like our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Again, daghang salamat.